for those of you that weren't in here. Keith Coulter is here. He's representing Coulter Natural Resource Group. And he spent 25 plus years in industrial logging sector. And he's going to give us some perspective from his work on Afognak. And without further ado, I'll let him give some more details. Thanks for coming, Keith.
I'm not used to these microphone things. Let's see. So this is going to be value laden and full of opinions, and I'm just going to have to deal with it. It's just the way I am. I got tired of trying to be politically correct. Let's see. Afognak Island. So NRCS, there's a lot of details with the reforestation topic. We're going to talk about like the whole smack from the harvesting, the road building through the reforestation. If you're totally into reforestation, we'll get to it, but you can't tell one story without hearing the other. And the only way that I was able to do the reforestation that we did out there on the island was through the NRCS. There was no plan, there was no program, there was virtually no reforestation process in place for me when I got there. They were aerial seeding, which blew my mind because I had only read about aerial seeding. I didn't actually know anybody who actually tries to throw spruce seed out of a plane and just expect it to grow. That's not my experience that I had in Oregon or Washington or any of the places I came from. So Mitch Michaud and Craig Sanders took Mitch's place there, but those guys were pivotal in making this program work and working with me. And I'm not exactly an easy guy to work with, but they managed to make it go. Claire, you got that? So Afognak, I imagine most of you guys know, it's not the end of the world, but you can see it. It's actually, if the planes fly, you can get back and forth in like 12 hours because you got to go from Afognak to Kodiak and then Kodiak to Anchorage, and there's always some delay or mechanical or something. But anyways, that's where it is. So it's a 700 square mile island, 18th largest in the US. There's all sorts of stuff out there. It's a sort of a maritime forest. You could classify it as old growth if that's your thing. But there's all sorts of varying tree diameters out there depending on where you are on the island. Lots of fish. I'm possibly the world's worst fisherman. I mean, I couldn't catch anything, but all you have to do on Afognak is drop a hook in the water and you catch a fish. It's that simple. We have hibernating bears. I get a lot of advice about bears. I spent 10 years doing the road location on Afognak, and I went places where most humans don't need to go, and had a lot of bear interactions. But the bears on Afognak don't necessarily hibernate all the time. They do their own thing, and you have to kind of be ready for them. But they always generally behave themselves. Go ahead, Claire. That's a representation of Sitka spruce trees. It's the only tree species out there other than tag alder. That's one of the more prolific type stands, or in terms of its in the size of that representation there, but they all don't look like that. Okay, Claire. And spruce or Devil's Club. If you guys, if they could start logging the Devil's Club, you could log out there forever. I'm going to be picking Devil's Club out of my body, I'm sure, for the next 50 years. It's worth noting. Okay, Claire. So I'm going to zip around. I talk about all sorts of things. And one of the things that I talk about a lot of the times when I'm doing a forestry presentation is, social license and all the stuff that you'd expect with a forestry type question or dilemma to harvest, not to harvest. One day it was a Sunday afternoon. I'm out with this little rubber raft. They had this 2-cycle engine that barely worked. And we're motoring over to some mouth of some river to go catch a fish. And, this guy's out there in his yacht, and he got a hold of me and figured out that I worked there and proceeded to, discuss how he didn't like the clear cutting and things. So it's, it's certainly an issue. I've been around it my entire career. Clear cuts don't bother me. I can see where people don't like them. I have a forestry degree. My BS is in forestry. I moved out of forestry into harvest engineering with my graduate work. But, one of the things they drill into your head in forestry is, if you're going to take a tree, you got to plant them back. And that was one of the principal problems I ran into when I took the position out there in Afognak. So I'm pretty sure the gentleman in the $1 million yacht wasn't thinking that the native corporations got a Western cash economy placed on them. They needed to generate revenue in order to satisfy their native corporation programs and those types of things. They had other objectives other than just maintaining the forest. So there's all sorts of ways to do this, and people aren't always going to agree with you. So anyways, next slide, Claire. So this is the thing. Everything that comes out to Afognak comes by a plane or a barge. Even if you're like on Kodiak, you'd still have a step up because you'd have an airport that can land jets. You'd have regular barge service. None of the major barge lines are going to stop at Afognak. So if you need anything, you got to get it out there from Anchorage or some other major hub, and it's a special destination. You got to hire out a barge like specifically for that. They don't just float in. So everything you do out there is super expensive, and logistics it's all a big deal. You got to do a lot of scheduling way ahead of time. So just keep that in mind. Go ahead, Claire. My job on Afognak was to run the export logging. We did about 35 to 40 million feet a year on my side of the fence, and constructed about 25 miles of forest road a year. All the logs are processed in the woods, delivered to a sort yard where they're scaled. Then they're bundled, placed in the water, the ocean, the bay there, and they're floated out there at a mooring until the ship comes in and they load them. Go ahead, Claire. Each export ship contains about 5.5 million feet. Depends on the time of the year, the draft. The ship has to be ocean going in the winter, so they got to load more water on, that kind of stuff for draft. But again, the reason why I'm going to talk a lot about the industry, and Alaska is probably the best example for exactly what happens to a forest product sector when industry dies off. And I'm going to hit on that a lot. Getting permitting to float those bundles of logs in the water now in the ocean is very difficult. You really can't even do it anymore. So we were grandfathered, we had permits and stuff in place to do that. But if you're trying to like develop new areas to do this kind of work, good luck. That stuff's pretty much been outlawed. Next slide, Claire. So most of my duties involved the harvest engineering. Most of my time was spent doing road layout. And there's, as you know or may not know, there's no clear-cut size limit, maximum, minimum. In Alaska, you can make them as big as you can make them. So that's generally what one of the units would look like with the road center lines are GPS, and radius of curvature, all that stuff's put in, crossings, and that would be what a sort of a larger unit looks like before harvesting. And generally, I tried to shoot for around 1,000 acres. Go ahead, Claire. This slide's a little bit dated. Lots of GPS over GIS. I switched over to tablets. Tablets are a little bit cumbersome in the field. I'll get a lot of rain. They're a little bit hard to kind of manage while you're doing a lot of walking around. That's a Trimble Juno that sort of was so didn't have a lot of memory. But anyways, there's a lot of GPS and GIS work that needs to be done. A lot of ground truthing. I carried a compass, but only if everything else failed. The days, which I'm old enough to remember, the days of walking around managing units with aerial photos and compasses, that was like milking a cow by hand. I was so glad when the GPS got, boned up enough where they could, really work on stuff, because, the compasses just, it cut your layout time in half. So go ahead. So all the operations are inspected every 6 weeks by the state of Alaska. And the operations have to be planned through detailed plans of operations. So they're all filed with the state, so the state knows exactly what you're doing out there. Go ahead, Claire. So when we get inspected, there'd be 3 agencies that would come out. Natural Resources would come out, Fish and Game, and the DEC would come out. A lot of work was done in the creeks. The anadromous waters catalog don't represent all the creeks that are out there. Some of the creeks they'd call anadromous that clearly weren't. Other creeks hadn't been cataloged yet. So all the creeks had to be, they had to be ground truth. So you made sure you didn't go, blundering in any buffer zones or anything. Go ahead, Claire. So anadromous Fish Creek buffers on the state regs were 66 feet. And then some of the NRCS programs we were doing allowed us to go out to 150 feet so we could capture that. We could capture the value of the timber that we didn't take, which was, I think, beneficial. Go ahead, Claire. So I talked a little bit about this before. Yeah, my average or minimums were 34 million feet a year. We did years as high as 42 million feet. Okay, Claire. Probably most of you aren't interested in any of this. If you're a harvest engineering guy, this is all kind of big deal stuff, but most stuff was hand fell, but there are a lot of parts of the island that could be mechanically fell. So there are purpose-built feller bunches out there as well. Go ahead, Claire. All the ground-based logging was done through shovel logging. And this is a good representation of the various sizes and the diameters of the trees out there. You'll get big stuff and you'll also get stuff that you'd find in Montana somewhere. Go ahead, Claire. Any steep slope work was done through cable logging. Okay. And everything was mechanically processed unless it was too big to run through the mechanized processing sides. They were hand bucked. Go ahead, Claire. So road building and crossings. Go ahead, Claire. So the roads needed to be constructed for all weather use. And that means they have to be rocked. So we're not just like tipping over trees and shoving stumps out of the way. They have to be, the roads have to be rocked because they have to be compliant per the Alaska Forest Practices Act. They're operating out there year round. Obviously, some years are snowier than others. Go ahead, Claire. A lot of the vehicle combinations like the yarder and stuff, that was 200,000 pounds plus, which if you keep in mind when we're going over, all the bridges out there are log stringer bridges. They're not like engineered bridges or rail car bridges or anything like that. So that's kind of a big deal when you're thinking about the weights that are going over them. Anybody in the audience who's accustomed to low boying stuff knows that you don't have shovels sitting on low boys with the tracks perpendicular to the trailer, but they're all private roads and the boom's usually not up in the air. It's all private roads, so we can do that kind of stuff. Go ahead, Claire. So bridges. Okay. Yeah. So like I said, everything was log stringer bridges. Anything over 1 foot in width were generally bridges. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is so the culverts, they had to be 140% or greater than the width of the creek. So it doesn't take much of a creek before your culvert size is super huge. And then you got to think about the logistics. You got to get all these things out there. You got to get them installed. They have to be embedded. So the substrate for the fishies is good. It gets to be a logistical disaster. So most everything was crossed with log stringer bridges. And that's a pretty good example of one right there. Go ahead, Claire. There's a filter fabric set over the bridge decking. So you got logs going across the creek, and then there's a filter fabric to go across the logs, and then you overlay with appropriate rock. And that way it keeps the fines and everything from going down to the creek. And yeah, you're in business. We put them in about 2 or 3 hours. And we put them in wherever we need to. Most of the units had first, second, and third order anadromous creeks in them when we logged across them all day long. Can be done just fine. Go ahead, Claire. Standard 5-axle log trucks did most of the hauling. Go ahead, Claire. So yeah, just about on average every year I do about 1,600 acres of clear cuts, about 25 miles of new forest road. And now we have to start getting into the seedlings. When I got there, there was a backlog of, so again, they were aerial seeding. There was aerial seeding with no site prep, and any of the literature that I could find on aerial seeding discussed using like 5 pounds of spruce seed per acre when they throw it out on the plane. And when I got there, we were using, I don't know, 2 or 3 ounces. And again, you would expect that the clear cut would be burnt flat, right? Seed bed and all that stuff. Yeah, none of that's going on. So you've got these huge slash accumulations and no ground prep. And I just don't believe that you can throw seed out of a plane and get it to work. If it was that easy, we'd been doing it in Oregon and all these other places. Maybe it works for somebody. I wasn't going to risk my professional ethical standards on it. So we were targeting about 350,000 to 500,000 seedlings planted per year. Go ahead, Claire. So this is the good stuff. Yeah, go to the next one. You can stop whenever you want, ask me questions or however, but so I inherited a contract it's the old timey logging Alaska stuff where they were more concerned about resource extraction and less concerned about how it was going to grow back. And, the contract that I inherited and the people that I worked with were old enough that this stuff was kind of, I don't know, reforestation, who cares? And, so I inherited a contract that I could only deal within the bounds of the contract. So that was a problem. That's why the NRCS was so helpful, because I wasn't going to get funding to do it anywhere else. The operators, any place you go in Oregon, any timber sale, they're going to be piling slash. Everything's going to be very neatly done. Out in the unit, before I even got done logging, when I was logging in Oregon, they'd be out there brush piling, that kind of stuff. It's just kind of the thing you did. I'm not around there. So huge slash accumulations, no site prep. And every unit was different, but probably 30% of each unit was just not plantable because it was, the spruce, if you've ever been around one, the limbs on those things are breathtaking. And, you go and cut them all off and leave them on the ground. It's nothing to have them waist high. So it was a problem. There was a lot of, even when you were doing artificial regeneration, there was still a lot of problems. Go ahead, Claire. So we were doing 1+0 seedlings. PRT was our nursery of choice. And you have to consider all the stuff when you use, where the seedlings come from. Well, they're either be grown in Oregon or British Columbia. And then you got to get them there. And you read all the stuff about reforestation, you'll see the stuff. Well, you got, by the time they get, I don't know, lifted or whatever they do, stuck in the box, they want 3 days before they're in the ground. And it's just 3 days. It would take 5 to 10 days, at least 10 days to 2 weeks just to get them there. You got to go through Canada. You got to go to Anchorage, and they got to put them on a barge. Then they got to float them to Kodiak. Then they got to get off the barge in Kodiak. And you got to have a landing craft. You got to put them on that. You got to get them to Afognak, we had a seed source within the company. But we were lucky because they don't go around collecting a lot of seeds anymore. That's another thing I could go on and on about, but we had 200 or 300 pounds of it, but there's not a lot of that floating around either. Go ahead, Claire. So Sitka spruce seed had to go to the nursery. So this is all stuff that, the NRCS was good about working with us. You had to plan way ahead of time, way out, like a year. The seed had to get to the nursery. The nursery, they do their germination tests and everything, and they'd start growing stuff. And you were guessing at how the logging was going to go. There was always all sorts of drama and problems. The logging contractor and the parental group were getting divorced, and there's labor issues, and they expected to cut 1,600 acres worth of wood this year, and then they'd only cut 500, or they'd cut 2,500. There's always this disastrous amount of problems coming down the pipe. You had to kind of sort of anticipate, And then the other thing is a lot of this stuff. So if the seedlings are on their way out to the island, and you got Donald Trump in office, and he was not letting any of the Hispanic workers fly, or he had some tragedy that, the Hispanic people couldn't do this and they couldn't do that. They were having trouble getting their visas and that kind of thing. That would be a problem because, what are you going to do with your seedlings when they get there and there's nobody to plant them? There was a lot of that kind of stuff. And again, the NRCS was, in lockstep with us trying to manage all these types of things. That's a pretty good shot of a clear cut, after harvesting. There's not a lot of work done to make it growable for all these seedlings you want to plant. And had I been king for a day and could have wrote a contract that was different, everything would have been brush piled, would have burned the brush piles and that kind of stuff. But that wasn't an option. Go ahead, Claire. So that's a landing craft, and you just getting we could keep them in a reefer over in Kodiak, so we could keep them cold. But once they're on the landing craft, actually even getting from Kodiak to Afognak could turn into a clown show just because of the weather. And you could get screwed up there too. So anyways, with 3 or 4 of those landing craft shipments, about 140,000 seedlings per shipment. Go ahead, Claire. And then I was lucky enough to get involved with Reforestation contracting when I first started out with the program, and he stuck with us the whole time. And we had a super good relationship. There weren't a lot of that was the other thing. There wasn't a lot of people like coming up from Washington or Oregon, like eager to get there. They, to come up and, bring a bunch of planters and whatnot. It, was hard to source somebody. But he stepped up to the plate and did it. And, we had to build a bunch of housing just for the planters. And, there was quite a bit of upfront cost that you had to kind of take care of to get the operation rolling. Cause there's 20 guys, you have to be able to feed them. They got to be able to get around. So my goal, once I kind of got things rolling, was to get on the clear cuts as soon as they were, the next year, if we could, because you had a few things that weren't going on. You didn't have any of the competing vegetation coming up yet. And that was one of the things that would, kill those units. After about 3 years, it's a jungle. I mean, you're full of Devil's Club and Cal McGraw, and it's a whole different thing. So you want to get on them as quick as you can. And then, again, I come out of Oregon. If there's a little bit too much vegetation, you just spray it, but not out there. It was a big to-do. You don't want to spray herbicide. So that was one of the drivers, to make sure you got on the units as quick as you could and get them planted back. So we were using 1+0 plug seedlings, kind of a little plug on them. These guys are called planters. They're more like forest athletes. It's a staggering pace. The ground's broken. They don't complain. They do their job. It went pretty well, but 1,500 seedlings per day per planter. A lot of those guys are making $400 some odd a day. I got virtually no interest from any of the shareholders to plant trees, like none. And no white people would plant trees either. So, I mean, you're not going to find these people around the corner if something's not right and you can't get planters or this or that and the other thing. I mean, it's kind of a big deal. Yes, sir. Yeah. So we average about 18 to 22,000 seedlings a day. And one of the other things that kind of bothered me is I didn't really have any facilities on the island to handle the seedlings once they were there. I didn't have a nice tree shed to put them in and get them all spread out so they wouldn't heat up. So you really had to kind of blow through the boxes as quick as you got them. You didn't want to have a lot of stuff sitting around because you couldn't manage it. If you took like a few hundred boxes out to the woods, let them go sit out in the unit, the bears would get in them and they just destroy them. So you had to be kind of careful where you put them and how long they were there. Go ahead, Claire. That's a pretty typical routine in the morning. Everybody loads up, just pickups full of boxes, and we just chase the clear cuts. When we started out, we were doing it for roughly $1 a seedling, and that's all in. That's the cost of seed. That's the sowing and planting costs, transportation, all the food and the housing. You could pay all of it, about $1. By the time we just kind of got done last year with our portion of the project, and it was around $1.25. So, $1.25 doesn't sound like a lot until you multiply it times 500. They would easily be $500,000 projects every year. So they'd be fairly, we didn't want to goof it up. There was a lot of money hanging around out there. Go ahead, Claire. So yeah, we were planting to the minimum of the reforestation requirements for the FERPA, which was 250 trees per acre. And you could argue that, yeah, you should be planting for 400 trees per acre and all that stuff. I was just glad to be getting that accomplished because, like I said, the money wasn't going to come from anywhere else. All the planting gear, spades, bags, food, housing, travel was all provided to the contractor. So we'd get the tickets for all those guys getting on planes, and that was always a good time because they're, especially in the Trump years when when they were kind of leaning on Hispanic workers and stuff. A lot of guys didn't want to travel in the airports and things, so it was it was tricky, it was sketchy sometimes. Go ahead, Claire. And the other thing is, the pickups that are out there, you got to have 6 or 7, and they all need to be road worthy. So all these guys get back and forth to work every day, and all that comes at a cost because the Afognak roads are not exactly mild to drive on. Pickup maintenance is a big deal and that kind of thing. Go ahead, Claire. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Then there's stuff that they don't tell you in Forestry 101, like when you're planting your trees and they give you all this information, how you get down to a mineral seedbed and all this. but you get this like 1 foot layer of ash out there from the Nova Erupta. I think my professors left that out of one of the, I don't know. So what do? Do you like bore through it and go down to the mineral soil? Do you plant in it? There's all these opinions. Well, if you did that, your seedling would be below ground. But anyways, there's all this kind of stuff going on out there. You got to kind of mess around with it. We had pretty good success just planting down into it. And I don't know if the trees like it or not. They're all growing. The challenges out there, the logistics were a big deal. Oregon, Canada to Afognak, there's quite a bit to that. Sourcing qualified planting crews, we sort of skirted getting really in any real trouble with that, but I'm sure that if you were doing a large operation, that would be something you're gonna struggle with. Most of the seedlings we had they kept them frozen or they were partially frozen, and that was to try to buy us time on the island. So when they get there, that's another thing. They'd get there, if you didn't do your part of the load would be partially frozen, some would be thawed, and then others would be frozen. If you goofed up your sequencing, you'd have nothing but frozen seedlings. And then the guys, they can't even get the bundles apart to plant them. So, oh, by the way, that's a problem. So we had to kind of mess with that. And weather was always a big deal. Some years I'd try to start them north on the island and the ground would still be frozen, and they'd have to like retreat to the south and plant down there. So there's a lot of messing about, and most of the time we were pretty successful. Everyone had a good attitude, but they just kind of wanted to get it done and over with. It was just a lot of work for about a 4-week period. I think, Claire, I don't know how many more there are. So yeah, seedling shipments were partially frozen. That was tricky to navigate, and yeah, my wife reminded me of that. 10 days to 2 weeks just to get from Canada to the island. So I think it outstrips any of the suggestions you'd read about planting trees where they want you to get them in the ground in 3 days. They never thought about Afognak, I guess. And again, the incentive was to plant as early in the spring as possible, because if it got warm, the planters, the physical labor, the humans part of it would start to struggle with the planting because it would get warmer. The bugs would come out. And then, it would be harder to keep the seedlings, from cooking in their little boxes. So go ahead, Claire. Oh, and now, yeah, that's a good picture of, plantable spaces or lack there. And that actually is unusual because the contractor wouldn't let any of their shovel loader operators actually stack brush like that. They'd get yelled at for doing that. But one guy did it before he got yelled at. And that shows you just the massive accumulated material there at the landing. And again, but from an industry perspective, reforestation aside, Alaska is a textbook example of what you get when you chase off all the industry. There's just about a third of every tree that we cut for the export trade gets thrown out. And you can see up there in the corner, there's no domestic market for any of that smaller 8 to 6 inch diameter on the large end. So all that just gets left. There's no biomass facilities nearby. There's all sorts of logistical challenges, even if there were, to get it from Afognak to wherever. I understand that. But any of us that are a little bit older now and have watched, the industry's been dying off year after year the whole time I've been up here. And now we've got the roadless rule. That's back. See Alaska kind of bagged their operations. It's not going to come back. Anyways, that always used to bother me quite a bit, because if you shot an elk, you have to take all the quarters. But if you chop a tree down, you could leave half of it out there, I suppose. So that's one of those things you can sort of mull over on your drive home tonight. Go ahead, Claire. That and the other thing, I told you we're going to be super opinionated. As I go along in my career, I'm noticing that we can only manage for one resource, or there's discussions seem to be gravitating towards only managing for one resource anymore. And I think Afognak was a pretty good example of, we used to work with the fish all the time. We had our Forest Practices Act that we'd follow, and, the fish were fine. But now it seems like if there's a fish within 10,000 miles of a unit, you have to wave off for the fish, and I don't really get it. So anyways, I think that's all of them, Claire. Yeah. Any questions?
So no natural regen out there?
There's natural regen, but the Sitka spruce is cyclical, like 5 to 7 years before there's a decent cone crop. And in that time, if the calamagrostis gets started or any of the competing vegetation, that's a super high variable. And most of these units were surrounded by trees and one, against other units and whatnot. And the natural regen could be spectacular in one unit, but on the whole, I'd say you were lucky if you got an adequately regenerated stand, maybe, I don't even know if you could hit the 30% mark. It just didn't happen. And you can fly over the island the next time you got a Kodiak and you look down there and you see all these brown clear cuts full of calamagrostis and no trees. You'll be like, why didn't the trees grow back? Well, there's one of the reasons, because they didn't have a reforestation plan. And, some of the stuff kind of got out of hand. So, and to go back and redo it. So if you go around and like mess around with an excavator, dig a little hole, and try to plant a tree, then they get massacred by the hares, the rabbits out there. So anyway. Nova erupta. The trees, the oldest one on Afognak that they've found is 800 years old. So my understanding was a Nova erupta happened, the creeks got filled with ash. It killed off some salmon runs, but the trees, I guess, more or less survived. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's an inventory out there in the 70s, and it's interesting because the spruce that was there at the time had like 6 or 7 inches of ash growing on the road.
Yeah, well, like if you cut down trees for a living and you stick your saw into one of those trees, yeah, your chain is like massacred after a few undercuts. So, but I don't want to bore. This is a reforestation conversation, but yeah, the ash out there is brutal. It got into all the equipment and like any of the moss that sits on the limbs out there, if you shake it or pull the moss off, there's an ash layer there. I mean, it's everywhere. It's nothing to be ignored. Go ahead.
So you're seeing the what?
1+ O's. Yeah. And we did, at times we'd experiment with larger seedlings and everything, but you had to be super, super hyper focused on the cost. And everything went up in price when the seedlings got bigger. Not only did the growing cost, you could put fewer in a box. That means you could get fewer on a landing craft, and then the planters could carry fewer of them. So yeah, in a real perfect world, it'd be nice to plant larger seedlings, but I was trying to get as many seedlings stuck in the ground for as low a cost as I could. Yeah, but it's a plug. Yeah. Fight for it. We do between 350,000 to 500,000. One year we shot for 800,000, and then they got the clear cuts on Kodiak. They were trying to plant and they didn't have any seedlings. So we sold 300,000. That would have been our biggest year, but there are years we did 500,000. Yeah. The trees are more carrot-like. Yeah, small.
Not that far away, right?
No. I think the way the birds drop the seed, or however they got established, is they got Afognak first, so the trees were older. And I think Kodiak's as far west as Sitka spruce grows. So there's people on Kodiak that are over on the other end of the island that they don't have trees at all. It's just kind of barren. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Maybe I guess the other tree species planted.
There are other, this is the crazy thing. It's like, I always think that in the middle of the night, the tree police are going to come get me because we let out some invasive tree species on the island. There are some larches that have been planted. They've messed around with cedar. There's been small establishments of stuff. I think so. I don't know. I didn't think that it was probably Afognak natives. It wasn't me. Siberian and larch. I just started shaking my head. I don't know. How about that? It. All right. Thanks, everybody. They used to throw a lot of that out of the plains. Yep. Lodgepole pine. Great. Thank you.